Have you ever wondered how a frozen, vast wilderness turned into one of the most peaceful and admired countries on Earth? Tonight, I'll tell you the full story of Canada. From the icy beginnings of the land to the modern multicultural nation it is today, this quiet journey will walk you through time. Slowly, calmly, and carefully. So let's begin. Long before Canada was called Canada, before it had provinces, cities, borders, or even names, it was land. Endless forests, frozen tundras, rivers that carved through rock over thousands of years, and silence, broken only by the wind or the cry of a distant bird. More than 20 dula. Once the ice receded, life returned. Plants grew, animals roamed, and eventually hummed. A 12,000 years ago, Perha. These early indigenous peoples did not see the land as something to conquer, but something to live with. They learned the language of nature, the timing of salmon, the paths of caribou, the change in the wind that meant a storm was near. Over centuries, they adapted to every corner of this vast place. They built canoes from birch bark and homes from snow, wood, or hides. Each region gave rise to different cultures, each with their own languages, stories, and ways of life. The Haudenosaunee and the Great Lakes region formed powerful confederacies. The Cree and Dene roamed the boreal forests and open plains. Along the Pacific coast, the Haida, Tlingit, and others created rich societies built around the sea. And in the Arctic, the Inuit mastered the harshness of ice and snow like no other people on Earth. They traded, traveled, told stories by firelight, and passed down knowledge across generations. They painted history on rocks, carved it into wood, and sang it into the stars. Canada wasn't just land, it was memory. A living landscape shaped by the minds, hearts, and hands of those who called it home. And for thousands of years, they lived in balance with it all. But far across the Atlantic Ocean, something was stirring. A different world, filled with kings, maps, ships, and a hunger for discovery, was about to turn its gaze toward this quiet northern continent. What began as a ripple would soon become a tide of change. And that's where our journey begins. By the late 1400s, wooden ships with towering sails began cutting through the cold Atlantic waves. European explorers, driven by dreams of gold, spices, and distant lands, were searching for a faster route to Asia. But what they found instead was something else. Vast, unfamiliar coastlines, and people already living there. In 1497, a Venetian explorer sailing for England named John Cabot landed somewhere on the eastern coast of what is now Canada, likely Newfoundland. Though his journey was brief and uncertain, it sparked European curiosity. The land was rich in fish, forests, and fur, resources that Europe craved. Soon after, French and Portuguese fishing fleets arrived regularly to harvest the Grand Banks, where cod were so abundant they could be scooped with baskets. But fishing was only the beginning. In the early 1500s, French explorer Jacques Cartier made several voyages to the region. In 1534, he claimed the land along the Gulf of St. Lawrence for France, even planting a cross to mark it. He met with the St. Lawrence Iroquois, trading beads and metal for food and furs. Cartier wrote about a word he heard from them, Canada, meaning village or settlement. He misunderstood it as the name of the land itself. And so, the name Canada was born. Over the following decades, more French explorers ventured inland, mapping rivers, forming alliances with indigenous peoples, and establishing fur trading routes. The fur trade, especially beaver pelts, used for fashionable European hats, became the backbone of France's growing interest in North America. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded a permanent settlement at Quebec, overlooking the St. Lawrence River. It was not a city yet, just a small cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by forests and snow. but it would become the heart of New France, a colony stretching along the river. The French did not try to conquer the land quickly. Instead, they often relied on alliances with indigenous nations. They traded, learned languages, and even intermarried. Some French settlers became coureurs de bois, or riders of the woods, living deep in the wilderness, blending European and indigenous ways of life. But European arrival brought more than trade. It also brought disease. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses spread rapidly, devastating indigenous communities who had no immunity. Entire villages disappeared in a matter of seasons. Meanwhile, to the south, the British were building their own colonies along the Atlantic coast, and they too had their eyes on the rich interior lands claimed by the French. What began as exploration was slowly turning into rivalry, and rivalry would eventually lead to war. The forests were quiet, but tension was rising. The land we now call Canada was becoming the center of a struggle between empires, and the people who had lived here for thousands of years were caught in the middle. By the 1700s, the land now known as Canada had become a chessboard for two of Europe's most powerful empires, France and Britain. The French controlled the St. Lawrence Valley, parts of the Great Lakes, and had stretched westward with fur trading posts deep into the wilderness. The British had colonies along the Atlantic coast, from New England down to the Carolinas, and they were expanding north. For years, tension simmered between these rivals. The fur trade was fiercely competitive. Disputes over territory and alliances with indigenous nations added more fuel. Small skirmishes broke out, then quieted, then flared up again. But the spark that lit the fire came in 1754, deep in the Ohio Valley, where both sides claimed control. That spark ignited what would become one of the most significant wars in Canadian history. It was called the 7 Years' War, but in North America, it's often remembered as the French and Indian War. On one side stood the British and their colonial militias, along with indigenous allies. On the other, the French, supported by their own indigenous partners and professional soldiers from Europe. The war was brutal. Forts were built, attacked, and burned. Villages changed hands. The forests echoed with musket fire, and rivers ran red during harsh winters and muddy springs. The French struggled to hold their ground, stretched thin across a vast landscape. In 1759, the most decisive moment arrived, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Just outside the fortified city of Quebec, British General James Wolfe and French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm led their troops into a swift, fierce fight. Both commanders died. But by the end of the battle, British forces had taken Quebec. A year later, Montreal fell too. New France was lost. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. France handed nearly all of its North American territories to Britain. In one stroke, the French Empire in Canada was gone, and the land became British. But the story didn't end with flags changing color. The French-speaking population, the Canadians, were now under British rule. They spoke a different language, followed a different religion, and lived by different customs. The British faced a difficult question. Should they try to erase French culture, or find a way to live with it? The answer came in the Quebec Act of 1774. Instead of forcing the Canadians to assimilate, Britain allowed them to keep their language, laws, and Catholic faith. It was a rare and significant moment of compromise in a colonial world that often demanded submission. But while British rulers tried to hold peace in Quebec, trouble was brewing to the south. The 13 colonies were growing restless. Taxes, laws, and distant kings stirred resentment. And soon, another war, a revolutionary one, would erupt. And once again, Canada would stand at a crossroads, watching history unfold on its doorstep. As the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the land to the north, The former New France, now under British control, remained quiet but uneasy. The British hoped that the Canadians might rise up and support their cause, helping suppress the rebellion in the south. But most French Canadians, still adjusting to British rule, chose neutrality. They had no love for the British crown, but even less interest in joining an unfamiliar revolution. The war raged on in the American colonies. Cities were besieged, farms burned, alliances shattered. And by 1783, Britain had lost. The United States of America was born. But with its birth came a wave of displacement. Tens of thousands of people who had remained loyal to the British crown, known as Loyalists, fled north, unwilling to live in the new republic. They were soldiers, farmers, merchants, and entire families. Many had lost everything. Their arrival would permanently change the makeup of Canada. Between 40,000 and 50,000 Loyalists crossed into British North America, settling in areas that would later become Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Some were of European descent, others were black Loyalists. Formerly enslaved people promised freedom for supporting the British. Their experiences were vastly different. While some received land and supplies, others faced poverty, racism, and harsh treatment in their new home. To accommodate the growing population, Britain reorganized its northern colonies. In 1791, it created two separate provinces, Upper Canada, now Ontario, largely English-speaking and Loyalist, and Lower Canada, now Quebec, predominantly French-speaking. Each had its own government, laws, and challenges. But this new order was not entirely peaceful. The English-speaking settlers wanted British-style institutions and land ownership. The French Canadians wanted to preserve their civil code, seigneurial land system, and Catholic traditions. These cultural tensions would simmer beneath the surface for decades. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples, who had once been powerful allies during the colonial wars, now found themselves increasingly pushed aside. As settlers claimed more land, traditional hunting grounds were lost, treaties were signed, often unfairly, and Indigenous voices were silenced in political matters. At the same time, British authorities kept a watchful eye on their new southern neighbor. The United States was expanding fast, and its ambitions were not limited by borders. And in 1812, just 3 decades after the Revolution ended, another war would break out. A second American invasion was coming, and Canada would be the battlefield once again. In the early 19th century, tensions between Britain and the United States flared once again. Trade restrictions, the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy, and British support for Indigenous resistance in the West pushed the U.S. toward conflict. In 1812, the United as Canada. American leaders believed that Canada would be easy to conquer. Some even predicted that the local population would welcome them as liberators. But when U.S. troops crossed the border into British North America, they met you. British regulars, Canadian militia, and Indigenous warriors, particularly under the leadership of the Shawnee chief Tay. In 18 AY, Maud Toronto. In Riwashi. But for Canada, the war had a lasting effect. Though the conflict ended in 181 Wea people. The W law, WHIT. After the war, peace slow. Immigration surged. Waves of settlers from Brit Airila CR rid A. Yet the growing population also meant growing pressure. French and English Canadians often disagreed on governance, rights, and the role of the church. Corruption in colonial politics frustrated many. By the 1830s, anger W. The next chapter of Canadian history would not be shaped by foreign armies, but by internal unrest. By the 1830s, tensions inside Canada were rising, not from foreign threats, but from deep divisions within. Both Upper Canada, modern Ontario, and Lower Canada, modern Quebec, were governed by small, elite groups loyal to the British Crown. In Upper Canada, this elite was called the Family Compact. In Lower Canada, it was the Chateau Clique. They controlled land, politics, and commerce, often ignoring the will of ordinary citizens, both English and French-speaking. Frustration turned into anger. Calls for responsible government, where elected officials, not appointed governors, made decisions, grew louder. In 1837, that anger exploded into open rebellion. In Upper Canada, reformers led by William Lyon Mackenzie took up arms. They hoped to establish a republic, inspired by the American Revolution. In Lower Canada, Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Patriots called for more rights for French Canadians, including language and cultural protections. They too rebelled. Both uprisings were quickly crushed by British forces. The rebels were poorly armed, disorganized, and lacked widespread support. Some were executed, others were exiled. But the message was clear. The people were tired of being ruled without a voice. The British government took notice. In 1838, they sent Lord Durham to investigate. His report was blunt. He blamed the rebellions on outdated colonial systems and on the division between English and French Canadians. He recommended two major changes: unite Upper and Lower Canada into a single province and give it a more responsible form of government. In 1841, Britain followed through. The province of Canada was created, with two regions: Canada West, formerly Upper Canada, and Canada East, formerly Lower Canada. Each side had equal seats in the new legislature, despite differences in population. The hope was that uniting French and English Canadians would create harmony, but instead, it often led to deadlock. Still, small steps were made toward democracy. In 1848, the province of Canada was granted responsible government. For the first time, the Executive Council was made up of elected officials who needed the support of the Assembly to govern. Power was slowly shifting from colonial elites to the people. Meanwhile, the country kept growing. Railways stitched towns together. Telegraph lines carried news in minutes instead of days. The population soared with new immigrants: Irish, Scottish, English, many fleeing poverty, famine, or unrest in Europe. But with growth came new challenges. In the West, the Hudson's Bay Company still controlled a vast fur trading empire. Beyond it lay Rupert's Land, an enormous territory sparsely populated and barely governed. The British North American colonies remained separate. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland each had their own systems, currencies, and policies. There was no single Canada, just a patchwork of provinces, identities, and ambitions. And south of the border, the United States was expanding fast, its eyes occasionally turning northward. By the 1860s, it had become clear: if Canada was to survive and thrive, it needed to unite. And that moment was coming, faster than anyone expected. By the early 1860s, British North America was a collection of colonies, divided by geography, language, politics, and economics. But a series of growing pressures made it clear: the time had come for something bigger. First, there was defense. After the American Civil War ended in 1865, the United States had a large, battle-hardened army. Many Canadians feared an invasion. The recent American purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 only added to the unease. The U.S. was expanding, and British colonies felt vulnerable. Second, there was trade. Britain had repealed many of its protective tariffs, and the Americans ended a trade deal with Canada. The colonies now needed a unified economy to support railroads, industry, and commerce. Separate currencies, laws, and customs duties created confusion and slowed growth. Third, political deadlock plagued the province of Canada. Canada East and Canada West had equal seats in government, but wildly different interests. Nothing could get done. Leaders from both sides began to consider a broader solution, uniting all the colonies into a single federal system. So in 1864, key political figures met in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to discuss the idea of confederation. What began as a meeting between maritime colonies quickly expanded when leaders from Canada East and West arrived with a grander plan. The discussions continued in Quebec City, where they drafted the framework for a new nation, one that would be united, but allow each region to maintain some control over its own affairs. After years of negotiation, resistance, and compromise, a historic moment arrived. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born through the British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament. The new country united Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia under a federal system with a prime minister, a parliament, and powers divided between national and provincial governments. The first prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, was a key architect of confederation. A skilled politician with a vision of a united Canada stretching from sea to sea, he believed in building a strong central government while still respecting regional differences. But confederation was only the beginning. Not all colonies joined at first. Prince Edward Island refused, and Newfoundland stayed out entirely. Western and northern lands remained under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company or Indigenous nations. And for French Canadians in Quebec, there were still fears about assimilation and the protection of language, religion, and culture. To ease those tensions, Quebec was given control over its own education system and civil law, helping preserve its unique identity within the new union. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples were not consulted during any part of Confederation. Their concerns, land rights, and sovereignty were largely ignored, a silence that would echo across generations. Still, the young Dominion stood as a political experiment, a country not born in war or revolution, but in negotiation and compromise. A country that had borders, but not yet shape, identity, but not yet unity. And ahead lay the challenge of building a nation across thousands of kilometers of forest, rock, prairie, and ice. After Confederation in 1867, the Dominion of Canada was still a small country, just 4 provinces hugging the eastern edge of a vast continent. But the dream was bigger, a united nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To make that dream real, Canada had to expand westward fast. The first step was acquiring more land. In 1869, the government of Canada purchased Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory from the Hudson's Bay Company. This massive area covered what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Arctic. It more than doubled the size of the young country. But this was not empty land. It was home to Métis, First Nations, and Inuit peoples, many of whom had lived there for generations. The Métis, a distinct group of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, had built communities, farms, and trading networks along the Red River, near what is now Winnipeg. When Canadian officials arrived to assert control, without consultation, tensions rose quickly. Led by Louis Riel, the Métis resisted. They formed a provisional government, demanding land rights, language protections, and recognition. Riel was well educated and politically skilled. He wanted inclusion, not rebellion. The standoff became known as the Red River Resistance. To avoid bloodshed, the Canadian government negotiated. The result was the creation of Manitoba in 1870, a small, postage stamp province meant to satisfy both settlers and the Métis. But promises made to the Métis were quickly broken. Land rights were delayed or denied. New settlers flooded in, changing the region's character. Riel fled into exile, considered a hero by some, a traitor by others. Meanwhile, Canada continued to grow. In 1871, British Columbia joined Confederation, but only after Ottawa promised something huge, a transcontinental railway connecting the west coast to the rest of the country. It was an enormous challenge. Mountains, forests, and swamps stood in the way. But the railway wasn't just a transportation project, it was a symbol of unity. Thousands of workers, many of them Chinese laborers, were brought in to lay track through some of the harshest terrain in North America. The work was brutal and dangerous. Accidents, landslides, and explosions were common. Many workers died. Their contribution would not be fully recognized for over a century. In 1873, another province joined, Prince Edward Island, which had initially rejected Confederation but now needed help with debts and a promise of railway links. With that, Canada's eastern edge was complete, but tensions in the west were not. As settlers pushed into the prairies, Indigenous nations were forced into signing treaties, often under pressure or misinformation. Traditional ways of life, especially those of Plains Indigenous peoples, were shattered as the bison herds disappeared. Disease, starvation, and displacement followed. Residential schools began to appear, aiming to erase Indigenous identity under the guise of education. The Dominion of Canada was growing rapidly, on maps, in railways, in population. But it was also leaving deep scars. The race to build a nation had begun, but not everyone was invited to shape its path. As Canada stretched westward, old tensions returned with new force. By the early 1880s, settlers continued pouring into the prairies, backed by government promises of land and opportunity. But for the Métis and First Nations, those promises came at a cost: the loss of land, rights, and culture. In 1885, the pressure finally exploded. Louis Riel, who had led the Red River Resistance 15 years earlier, returned from exile. The Métis once again felt abandoned by Ottawa. Their petitions for land rights had gone unanswered, and new settlers were overtaking traditional territory. This time, the resistance rose near the South Saskatchewan River, in a settlement called Batoche. Riel formed a second provisional government, believing peaceful negotiation might once again lead to compromise. But the Canadian government, led by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, had other ideas. With the Canadian Pacific Railway now partially complete, troops could be moved quickly to the west. The Northwest Rebellion was brief but intense. Armed clashes broke out between Métis fighters and government forces. One of the most notable battles was at Batoche, where Riel's forces, outnumbered and poorly supplied, made a final stand. After several days of fighting, the resistance collapsed. Riel was captured. He stood trial for treason, and despite public outcry, especially in Quebec, where many saw him as a defender of minority rights, he was found guilty. In November 1885, Louis Riel was hanged. His death deepened the divide between French and English Canada. In the West, he was branded a traitor. In the East, a martyr. That same year, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed, a ribbon of steel stretching from coast to coast. It was a monumental achievement, a symbol of progress, unity, and national pride. But it was also a symbol of control, a tool to move troops, settlers, and industry quickly across the land. Western Canada began to change rapidly. Towns sprouted along the tracks. Grain elevators appeared on the horizon. Immigration surged, with people arriving from Ukraine, Germany, Poland, China, and Scandinavia. The prairies became Canada's breadbasket, feeding not just the nation, but the world. In 1896, Wilfrid Laurier became Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister. He believed in bridging divides, East and West, French and English. Under his leadership, immigration expanded even further, especially to the West, which was quickly being transformed into an agricultural powerhouse. But the newcomers found a harsh, unfamiliar land. Winters were long, isolation was deep, and success was never guaranteed. Still, the promise of land and freedom kept them moving, turning prairie soil into farms, and wooden stations into towns. By the turn of the century, Canada was no longer a loose collection of provinces and wilderness. It was becoming a fully formed nation-state, with a growing economy, rising cities, and a place on the world stage. And soon, that stage would erupt in flames. A war was coming, unlike anything the world had ever seen. In 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo set off a chain of events that would plunge the world into its first truly global conflict, the Great War, later known as World War I. When Britain declared war on Germany, Canada, still a dominion of the British Empire, was automatically at war too. But unlike in past centuries, Canadians were not just colonists following orders. They answered the call by the thousands, volunteering to fight in a war far from home for a cause few fully understood. More than 600,000 Canadians enlisted. From farms, factories, and fishing towns, young men, some still teenagers, boarded ships bound for Europe. They expected adventure and heroism. What they found were trenches, mud, and misery. The battles of the Western Front became legendary. Ypres, where Canadian troops faced chlorine gas for the first time. The Somme, where over 24,000 Canadians were killed or wounded in a single campaign. And most famously, Vimy Ridge in 1917, where all 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time under Canadian command. The victory at Vimy became a defining moment. The high ridge had resisted capture for years, but the Canadians, through detailed planning and coordinated assault, succeeded where others had failed. It came at a terrible cost, over 10,000 casualties. Yet, many viewed the battle as the moment Canada stepped out of Britain's shadow and proved itself on the world stage. Back home, the war brought massive change. Industry surged as factories turned out weapons, uniforms, and supplies. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. In 1917, some were granted the right to vote, beginning a long journey towards suffrage. But the war also deepened internal divisions. The government introduced conscription, mandatory military service, in 1917. Many English Canadians supported it. But in Quebec, where anti-war sentiment ran deep, it sparked anger and protests. French Canadians felt they were being forced into a British war without respect for their language, culture, or choices. Still, the war ended in 1918, and Canada emerged forever changed. More than 60,000 Canadians had died. Another 170,000 were wounded. It was a staggering toll for a young country of just 8 million. In the years that followed, Canada began to assert more independence. It signed the Treaty of Versailles as a separate entity, and in 1919, it joined the newly formed League of Nations. These were small steps, but symbolically powerful. Canada was no longer just a colony. It was a nation with a voice. At home, veterans returned to a different country. The economy boomed briefly, then stumbled. Cities grew. Roads spread across the land, but not all Canadians shared in the post-war promise. Indigenous veterans returned to find they had no recognition, no pensions, and fewer rights than when they left. Many were even denied the vote. The 1920s brought bright lights and modern change, but also instability. Canada was walking into a new century, proud, grieving, and uncertain of what would come next. And just over the horizon, something dark was already forming, a global storm called the Great Depression. The 1920s in Canada were a time of both hope and uncertainty. The roaring economy brought new technologies, cars, radios, and urban growth. But beneath the surface, many Canadians struggled with poverty, especially in rural areas and among indigenous communities. Then, in 1929, the stock market crash in the United States triggered the Great Depression, a worldwide economic disaster that would last for most of the 1930s. Canada was hit hard. Exports plummeted, factories closed, and unemployment soared. By 1933, about 30% of Canadians were out of work. Families lost their savings, farms were foreclosed, and soup kitchens became common. The prairies suffered a special kind of disaster. Drought, dust storms, and soil erosion turned vast stretches of farmland into the Dust Bowl. Crops failed, livestock perished, and farmers faced starvation. Many were forced to abandon their homes, traveling westward in search of work or relief. The federal government struggled to respond. Initial relief efforts were small and scattered. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett tried to implement public works programs, but they were often too little too late. Many Canadians felt abandoned. Social unrest grew. Strikes, protests, and political movements gained momentum. Groups like the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF, a precursor to Canada's modern Social Democratic Party, called for reforms, including unemployment insurance and social welfare. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples faced even greater hardships. Residential schools continued to operate, aiming to erase Indigenous languages and cultures. Many communities were cut off from aid, and traditional ways of life were under threat. Despite the hardship, Canadian society showed resilience. Neighbors helped neighbors. New ideas about government responsibility and social justice were debated. The Depression reshaped how Canadians thought about their country and their future. By the late 1930s, the global situation was again shifting. Threats of war were rising in Europe and Asia. Canada, still connected to Britain, faced difficult decisions about its role in another coming conflict. The lessons of the Depression about hardship, unity, and government responsibility would soon be tested again. But for now, Canadians braced themselves for a new and uncertain chapter in history. By the late 1930s, the world was once again teetering on the edge of war. The rise of fascist powers in Europe and Asia threatened global peace. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain declared war, and once again, Canada was automatically involved as part of the British Empire. But unlike the First World War, Canada was now more confident and independent. Parliament debated for several days before officially declaring war on Germany on September 10, 1939, a full week after Britain's declaration. This small delay was a clear sign Canada was beginning to make its own decisions. Over the next 6 years, more than 1 million Canadians served in uniform, a significant number for a country of about 11 million people. The war effort was total. Factories shifted to producing tanks, planes, and ships. Women worked in factories, farms, and military auxiliaries, taking on roles never before open to them. Canadian soldiers fought in nearly every major campaign. From the skies over Britain during the Battle of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, and the push through Italy and into Germany, Canadian forces earned a reputation for skill and bravery. One of the war's defining moments came in 1944 with the D-Day invasion on June 6. Canadian troops were assigned Juno Beach, one of 5 landing sites along the Normandy coast. Despite heavy resistance and casualties, they secured their objectives, a critical step toward the Allied victory. Back home, the war united the country but also exposed divisions. French Canadians were less enthusiastic about the conflict, partly due to memories of conscription debates in World War I. When the government introduced conscription again in 1944, it sparked protests, especially in Quebec. The war also accelerated social change. Women gained the right to vote federally in 1940, and their wartime contributions challenged traditional gender roles. Indigenous peoples served bravely overseas, though they continued to face discrimination at home. When the war ended in 1945, Canada had emerged stronger, more industrialized, and with a clearer sense of national identity. The country became a founding member of the United Nations and played a role in building the post-war world. But the peace also brought new challenges: the start of the Cold War, the need to rebuild economies, and the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights. Canada had come a long way from its icy beginnings, but its story was far from over. The end of World War II marked the beginning of a new era for Canada. The nation entered a period of unprecedented economic growth and social change. Factories that once produced tanks and planes shifted to making cars, appliances, and goods for a booming consumer market. Between 1945 and 1960, Canada's population surged due to a post-war baby boom and a wave of immigration. Millions came from Europe, seeking safety and opportunity after the devastation of the war. They settled in growing cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, transforming Canada into a multicultural society. Governments invested heavily in infrastructure, building highways, schools, hospitals, and expanding social programs. The introduction of universal healthcare began in the 1950s in provinces like Saskatchewan, eventually spreading nationwide by the 1960s, shaping Canada's identity as a country that cares for all its citizens. During this time, Canada also worked to define its place on the world stage. It became a member of NATO in 1949, committed to collective defense during the Cold War. Canadian peacekeepers earned global respect for their roles in United Nations missions, promoting peace in conflict zones around the world. However, not all Canadians shared equally in prosperity. Indigenous peoples continued to face systemic discrimination, forced assimilation policies, and poor living conditions. Residential schools, designed to erase Indigenous culture, remained active, causing lasting trauma that would only begin to be addressed decades later. The 1960s brought new challenges and transformations. The Quiet Revolution in Quebec sparked a cultural awakening, with French Canadians demanding more control over their language and institutions. This led to rising tensions around national identity, bilingualism, and the future of the Federation. Amidst these debates, the Canadian government adopted the Canadian flag in 1965, a bold symbol of a distinct, united country. It replaced the British Red Ensign, marking a new chapter where Canadians would define their own identity. By the late 1960s, Canada was no longer just a former British colony. It was a vibrant, diverse nation facing its future with confidence, yet still wrestling with the legacies of its past. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of profound change and upheaval in Canada, as the country grappled with issues of identity, language, and power. In the province of Quebec, the Quiet Revolution dramatically transformed society. Starting in the early 1960s, Quebecers sought to modernize their economy, education, and government, moving away from the dominance of the Catholic Church and traditional elites. This cultural awakening sparked a surge of Quebecois nationalism, with many demanding greater recognition of French language and culture within Canada. At the same time, tensions over language rights spread across the country. English and French Canada had long been divided by culture and history, but now the debate entered the political mainstream. The federal government responded with the Official Languages Act of 1969, declaring Canada officially bilingual and promising services in both English and French. Meanwhile, the desire for constitutional change grew. Canada's constitution was still the British North America Act of 1867, a British law. Many Canadians wanted full control over their own constitution, including a Charter of Rights and Freedoms to guarantee civil liberties. These tensions came to a head in the 1980s under Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Trudeau, a strong federalist, pushed hard to patriate the Constitution, bringing it home from Britain, and to enshrine the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. This document guaranteed freedoms like speech, religion, and equality before the law. But not all provinces agreed. Quebec, in particular, refused to sign the new constitution, feeling it did not address their demands for autonomy and recognition as a distinct society. This refusal left a lasting political divide. During the same period, the issue of Quebec's sovereignty gained momentum. In 1980, the first referendum on Quebec independence was held. Canadians voted no, but the debate lingered, never far from the surface. Canada was evolving, no longer just a bilingual country, but a multicultural one, with immigrants arriving from Asia, the Caribbean, and around the world. The country sought to balance unity with diversity, federal power with provincial rights, tradition with modernity. This era laid the groundwork for Canada's future challenges and triumphs. A country still learning how to hold itself together while celebrating its differences. From the late 20th century onward, Canada transformed into one of the world's most diverse countries. After decades of primarily European immigration, new waves arrived from Asia, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Middle East. These new Canadians brought languages, traditions, and religions that reshaped the nation's cultural fabric. In 1971, Canada became the first country to adopt an official policy of multiculturalism, recognizing the rights of all ethnic groups to maintain their heritage while contributing to Canadian society. This policy promoted inclusion, combating discrimination, and encouraging cultural exchange. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal grew into global hubs, with vibrant neighborhoods reflecting the world's diversity. Festivals, food, music, and art flourished, and Canadians began to define themselves not just by their British or French roots, but by a shared commitment to diversity and inclusion. Yet, the growth of multiculturalism also brought challenges. Integrating newcomers required new social programs, language training, and policies to address inequality. At times, tensions flared over immigration levels, cultural differences, and economic opportunity. Meanwhile, debates over Indigenous rights gained urgency. Survivors of the residential school system began speaking out about abuses, sparking calls for reconciliation. The government slowly acknowledged past wrongs, leading to the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the early 2000s, a painful but necessary step toward healing. Politically, Canada balanced its unique identity as a multicultural, bilingual federation. The government enacted laws protecting minority languages, promoted official bilingualism, and worked to ensure equal opportunities for all citizens. This era saw Canada emerge as a global leader in human rights, peacekeeping, and diplomacy. But it also faced ongoing challenges. From economic inequality to regional tensions and environmental concerns. As the 21st century progressed, Canadians continued shaping their identity, guided by values of diversity, inclusion, and respect, all rooted in a complex history stretching back centuries. As Canada entered the late 20th and early 21st centuries, one of the most profound and complex challenges it faced was addressing the long history of injustice toward its Indigenous peoples. For centuries, Indigenous nations, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, had experienced dispossession, forced assimilation, and systemic discrimination. Central to this painful history was the residential school system, established in the 19th century and operating well into the late 20th century. Indigenous children were taken from their families and communities, often forcibly, and sent to schools run by churches with government support. These schools aim to erase Indigenous languages, cultures, and identities. Many survivors have told harrowing stories of abuse, neglect, and cultural loss. By the 1980s and 1990s, survivors began coming forward to share their experiences, demanding recognition, apologies, and reparations. This led to a growing national conversation about truth and reconciliation, confronting dark chapters that many Canadians had long ignored or denied. In 2008, the Canadian government formally apologized for the residential school system. This apology was a watershed moment, opening the door to more meaningful dialogue and healing. Soon after, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission (TRC) was established to document survivor stories and recommend actions toward reconciliation. The TRC's 94 calls to action laid out a blueprint for repairing relationships, addressing inequalities, and respecting Indigenous rights. These included reforms in education, health, justice, and governance, as well as the recognition of Indigenous languages and cultures. Yet, progress has been uneven. Indigenous communities continue to face disproportionate poverty, poor housing, and limited access to clean water. Land claims and treaty rights remain contentious issues, with ongoing legal battles and political negotiations. Despite these challenges, Indigenous peoples have made powerful strides in reclaiming their culture and sovereignty. Self-government agreements, revitalization of languages, and cultural renewal projects are reshaping Canada's identity. Today, Canada continues to wrestle with its past while striving to build a future grounded in respect and partnership. This journey remains a vital part of the nation's ongoing story, a reminder that history is not just about the past, but about shaping a more just and inclusive Canada for all. As Canada moved further into the 21st century, its political landscape grew increasingly complex. The nation balanced the ideals of unity and diversity, while regional differences and economic challenges shaped public debate. One of the enduring tensions was the relationship between the provinces and the federal government. Canada's system of federalism meant power was divided, but questions about jurisdiction and resource control often sparked disputes, especially in wealthier provinces like Alberta and resource-rich regions. The oil industry, centered in Alberta, became both an economic boon and a source of conflict. While oil exports fueled growth and jobs, debates over pipelines, environmental protection, and Indigenous rights sparked protests and political upheaval. At the same time, the issue of Quebec's sovereignty persisted. After the narrow defeat of the 1995 referendum on independence, the province continued to assert its unique culture and language, negotiating powers within the Federation. Political parties, like the Bloc Québécois, represented these aspirations at the federal level. National leaders grappled with these challenges, often trying to balance economic growth, environmental concerns, and social justice. Prime ministers like Jean Chrétien, Stephen Harper, and Justin Trudeau each faced moments of crisis and opportunity, from trade negotiations to immigration policy to international diplomacy. Immigration remained a cornerstone of Canada's identity. The country welcomed hundreds of thousands of newcomers annually, fueling urban growth and innovation. Cities became hubs of cultural diversity, but also faced challenges in housing, infrastructure, and social integration. Canada also took on a greater role in global affairs, participating in peacekeeping missions, climate change initiatives, and international trade agreements. The country sought to be seen as a middle power, promoting diplomacy and multilateral cooperation. Yet, domestic issues remained pressing. Affordable housing, healthcare access, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples were ongoing struggles. Political polarization and debates over national identity echoed global trends. Through it all, Canadians continued to define themselves not by uniformity, but by a shared commitment to dialogue, diversity, and democracy, values forged over centuries of complex history. Canada's vast and diverse landscape has always been central to its identity, from the rugged Rockies to the endless prairies, the dense forests to the icy Arctic. Yet, as the country developed, the impact of industrialization and resource extraction became increasingly evident. By the late 20th century, environmental concerns began to take hold in Canadian society. The pollution of air and water, deforestation, and the loss of wildlife habitats sparked new awareness and activism. In the 1970s and 1980s, environmental organizations grew in influence, advocating for the protection of national parks and endangered species. The government responded with laws aimed at reducing pollution and conserving natural spaces. One of Canada's most iconic contributions was the establishment of national parks, places like Banff, Jasper, and Gros Morne, preserving natural beauty and biodiversity for future generations. These parks became symbols of pride and a connection to the land. However, challenges persisted. The expansion of industries like logging, mining, and oil sands extraction raised difficult questions about economic growth versus environmental stewardship. The development of the Alberta oil sands in particular became a flashpoint, drawing international criticism over greenhouse gas emissions and Indigenous rights. Climate change emerged as a global issue, and Canada was both a contributor and a victim. Melting Arctic ice, rising temperatures, and changing ecosystems affected northern communities profoundly, especially Indigenous peoples whose way of life depended on the land and wildlife. In recent decades, Canadian governments have committed to international agreements like the Paris Accord, aiming to reduce emissions and invest in renewable energy. Public support for sustainability has grown, and younger generations advocate strongly for environmental justice. Yet balancing economic interests, energy demands, and ecological preservation remains a complex task, one that will define Canada's future as much as its past. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Canada embraced rapid technological change, transforming its economy and society. From advances in communication to breakthroughs in medicine and science, technology began reshaping everyday life. Canadian researchers and companies contributed to global innovations. The invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in the late 19th century had already set a precedent, but now fields like computer science, biotechnology, and space exploration were booming. Universities and research centers across the country became hubs for new ideas. Canada played a key role in developing medical technologies, including insulin and artificial heart valves, improving healthcare worldwide. The growth of the internet and digital technologies revolutionized commerce, education, and social interaction. Canadian cities saw a surge in tech startups and innovation hubs, especially in Toronto, Waterloo, and Vancouver. This digital revolution brought both opportunity and challenge. New jobs were created, but traditional industries faced disruption. Privacy concerns and cybersecurity became important public debates. The government invested in expanding broadband access, aiming to connect remote and rural communities. Canada also became a leader in promoting ethical standards in artificial intelligence and digital governance, reflecting its values of inclusivity and respect for human rights. Yet, the rapid pace of change highlighted inequalities. Access to technology remained uneven, particularly in Indigenous and northern communities. Efforts to bridge the digital divide became a priority for policymakers and activists. As Canadians moved further into the digital age, they balanced embracing innovation with preserving social cohesion and equity, ensuring technology served all citizens. In recent decades, Canada has continued evolving into a nation celebrated for its social progress and rich cultural diversity. laws and policies have increasingly reflected a commitment to human rights, equality, and inclusion. One of the most significant advancements has been the recognition of LGBTQ+ rights. Same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide in 2005, making Canada one of the first countries to do so. Anti-discrimination laws protect people from bias based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, fostering greater acceptance and community support. Canada's multiculturalism has also flourished. Festivals, cuisine, art, and music from every corner of the globe thrive in Canadian cities, contributing to a vibrant national culture. Indigenous artists and storytellers have gained renewed visibility, sharing their traditions and histories widely. The country has made strides in gender equality, with increasing representation of women in politics, business, and public life. However, challenges remain, including closing wage gaps and addressing violence against women. Education and healthcare remain pillars of Canadian society, with ongoing debates about access, quality, and funding reflecting a commitment to improving these systems. At the same time, Canada faces contemporary challenges such as addressing climate change, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, housing affordability, and immigration pressures. Despite these issues, the country's resilience and openness remain defining traits. Canadians often emphasize values like compassion, respect, and community, qualities forged through centuries of complex history and diverse experiences. Today, Canada stands as a nation proud of its past yet hopeful and determined to build a just and inclusive future for all its people. Throughout its history, Canada has sought to play a meaningful role in international affairs. From early peacekeeping missions to modern diplomatic efforts, the country has aimed to be a force for stability, justice, and cooperation. After World War II, Canada was a founding member of the United Nations, committing itself to global peace and human rights. Canadian diplomats and soldiers participated in peacekeeping missions around the world, from Cyprus to Bosnia, Rwanda to Haiti, often earning praise for neutrality and professionalism. Canada also became a key player in international organizations like NATO, the G7, and the World Trade Organization. Its voice has been influential in promoting free trade, environmental agreements, and humanitarian aid. Yet, navigating global politics has not been without difficulty. Balancing relationships with powerful allies like the United States with independent foreign policy choices has required careful diplomacy. Issues like the Iraq War in 2003 and climate change negotiations have tested Canada's international commitments. Trade remains crucial to Canada's economy, with agreements like NAFTA, now USMCA, shaping relations with the U.S. and Mexico. At the same time, tensions over tariffs, energy exports, and supply chains have highlighted vulnerabilities. Canada faces ongoing global challenges, from migration and refugee crises to cybersecurity threats and pandemics, requiring cooperation both at home and abroad. Still, Canada's reputation as a peaceful, multicultural, and democratic nation endures, reflecting centuries of history and a vision for a more just world. Canada's journey has been long and complex, from the first Indigenous nations thriving on the land, through colonial struggles, confederation, 2 world wars, social change, and the ongoing quest for unity in diversity. Today, Canada stands as a vibrant, multicultural country, proud of its history yet keenly aware of the work still to be done. The country is a tapestry of cultures, languages, and traditions. Millions of immigrants from around the world have made Canada their home, enriching its cities and communities. Indigenous peoples, whose histories span thousands of years, continue to assert their rights and revitalize their cultures, playing a vital role in shaping Canada's identity. Canada's challenges are many. Climate change poses urgent threats to its vast natural environments. from melting Arctic ice to forest fires and changing ecosystems. The government and citizens alike face the task of balancing economic development with environmental stewardship. Social justice remains a priority. Efforts to address inequalities related to race, gender, and income continue, alongside a commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The legacy of residential schools and systemic discrimination calls for ongoing reflection and action. Politically, Canada navigates a complex federal system where provinces and territories assert their autonomy, sometimes clashing with national priorities. The debate over Quebec's unique status and language rights remains a sensitive and evolving issue. On the world stage, Canada continues to be a committed partner in peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and global diplomacy. It promotes human rights and democratic values while managing relationships with powerful neighbors and global players. Looking ahead, Canada's future will be shaped by innovation, inclusivity, and resilience. The country aims to harness technology for economic growth, foster social cohesion in an increasingly diverse society, and protect its natural heritage for generations to come. Canada's story is far from over. It is a living, breathing narrative, one that invites every Canadian to be part of shaping the next chapter, building a nation that reflects the hopes and dreams of all its people. Canada's political landscape today is shaped by its unique system of federalism, a balance between a strong central government and powerful provinces and territories. This balance allows for regional differences while maintaining national unity, but it also creates ongoing challenges. The country is governed by a parliamentary democracy, with the Prime Minister leading the federal government and premiers heading the provinces. Elections, held every 4 years, bring changing political tides, reflecting Canadians' diverse views and priorities. One of the most persistent issues in Canadian politics is the relationship between the federal government and Quebec. Quebec maintains a distinct identity, with French as its official language and a rich cultural heritage. Political parties, like the Part 1 Québécois, advocate for greater autonomy or even independence, fueling debates about Canada's future. In recent decades, federal governments have sought to accommodate provincial demands while promoting national policies. Issues such as healthcare funding, environmental regulation, and Indigenous rights often involve complex negotiations between Ottawa and the provinces. New political movements have emerged, reflecting shifts in Canadian society. Parties like the Green Party emphasize environmental concerns, while others focus on economic reform, social justice, or regional interests. Canada's political system encourages compromise, coalition building, and respect for minority voices. Yet, tensions persist over issues like resource management, language rights, and regional disparities, especially between the more populous provinces like Ontario and British Columbia and the less populated Atlantic provinces and territories. Despite these challenges, Canada's democracy remains vibrant and stable. Public engagement through voting, activism, and dialogue reflects a commitment to democratic values that have evolved over centuries. The ongoing balancing act between unity and diversity, local and national interests, continues to define Canadian politics, shaping a country that values both its shared identity and the unique voices within it. Canada's economy has undergone significant transformations over the past decades, evolving from a resource-dependent country to a diversified, innovation-driven nation. Natural resources like oil, minerals, and timber continue to play a vital role, but the growth of technology, services, and knowledge industries has reshaped the economic landscape. The country boasts vast reserves of oil and gas, especially in Alberta's oil sands, which contribute significantly to national wealth and export revenue. However, environmental concerns, and global shifts toward renewable energy have sparked debates about the future of fossil fuels and sustainable development. Urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal have become hubs for technology and innovation. Canadian startups in fields such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean energy, and software development are gaining international recognition. Universities and research institutions foster entrepreneurship and scientific breakthroughs, helping Canada compete globally. Trade remains central to Canada's prosperity. The United States is its largest trading partner, but Canada has expanded ties worldwide through agreements like the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. These deals open markets for Canadian goods and services, encouraging growth and diversification. Challenges remain, including economic inequality, regional disparities, and the need to support workers displaced by technological change and globalization. The government has launched initiatives to promote skills training, innovation funding, and support for small and medium-sized businesses. The rise of the green economy offers new opportunities. Investments in clean energy, sustainable infrastructure, and environmental technologies aim to balance economic growth with climate responsibility. Canada's commitment to reducing carbon emissions aligns with global efforts to combat climate change. Canada's economy today is a dynamic blend of tradition and innovation, grounded in natural wealth, but increasingly driven by knowledge, technology, and sustainability. The country faces the future with resilience, ready to adapt to global changes and build prosperity for all its citizens. The relationship between Canada and its Indigenous peoples has become one of the most important and complex issues in the nation's modern history. For centuries, Indigenous communities faced displacement, cultural suppression, and systemic discrimination, the effects of which continue today. In recent decades, Canada has taken significant steps toward reconciliation, acknowledging past injustices and working to build a more respectful, equitable future. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, active from 2008 to 2015, played a pivotal role by documenting survivor stories of the residential school system and issuing 94 calls to action to address the lasting impacts. Reconciliation involves many areas: education, health, justice, and governance. Efforts are underway to incorporate Indigenous history and perspectives into school curricula, improve healthcare access and outcomes, and reform the justice system to reduce Indigenous overrepresentation. Land rights and self-government remain critical and ongoing challenges. Many Indigenous nations negotiate treaties and agreements to reclaim control over traditional territories and resources. These negotiations seek to balance Indigenous sovereignty with provincial and federal jurisdictions. Cultural revitalization is a powerful part of this process. Indigenous languages, arts, and traditions are being revived and celebrated, supported by communities, governments, and organizations. Events like National Indigenous Peoples Day honor the diversity and resilience of Indigenous cultures. However, inequalities persist. Indigenous peoples face higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing. Issues like access to clean drinking water in many communities highlight ongoing disparities. Reconciliation is a journey, not a destination. It requires commitment from all Canadians to listen, learn, and act. By confronting this shared history and embracing Indigenous leadership and knowledge, Canada aims to create a society that truly respects and honors its First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Canada's identity as a multicultural nation is one of its defining features. Since the official adoption of multiculturalism policy in 1971, the country has welcomed millions of immigrants from all over the world. This rich diversity has shaped Canada's cities, culture, and society in profound ways, making it a beacon of inclusivity and openness. Immigration has fueled economic growth and cultural vibrancy, with newcomers bringing languages, traditions, religions, and perspectives that enrich Canadian life. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver are among the most diverse in the world, with dozens of languages spoken and cultures celebrated daily. Multiculturalism has been enshrined not only in policy, but also in the values Canadians hold dear: respect, tolerance, and acceptance. Festivals celebrating everything from Diwali to Lunar New Year, Caribbean carnivals to Indigenous powwows, are regular parts of Canadian life, reflecting the country's mosaic of identities. Yet, embracing diversity also presents challenges. Integration and social cohesion require ongoing effort. Some immigrants and minority groups face barriers in employment, education, and access to services. Discrimination and racism, though less overt than in some countries, remain issues that communities and governments actively combat. Systemic inequalities affect not only visible minorities, but also marginalized groups including Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged communities. Efforts to address these disparities include policy reforms, community programs, and public education campaigns aimed at fostering equality and inclusion. Canada also faces debates around immigration levels, refugee resettlement, and the balance between welcoming newcomers and ensuring social services meet demand. Political discussions often reflect broader global concerns about migration and national identity. Despite these complexities, multiculturalism remains a source of strength and pride. Canada's commitment to diversity shapes its laws, education, and public life, continually evolving to meet new realities. The ongoing work to create an inclusive society is not without obstacles, but Canadians largely embrace the idea that diversity enriches the nation, making it stronger, more creative, and better equipped to face the challenges of a globalized world. Canada's immense natural beauty, vast forests, towering mountains, sprawling prairies, and Arctic tundra is a defining part of its identity. But as the 21st century progresses, the country faces pressing environmental challenges that test its commitment to preserving this heritage. Climate change is one of the most urgent issues. Canada's average temperatures are rising faster than the global average, impacting ecosystems, communities, and industries. Melting Arctic ice threatens northern wildlife and Indigenous ways of life, while more frequent wildfires, floods, and extreme weather events affect cities and rural areas alike. The government has recognized the importance of addressing climate change through national strategies and international agreements. Canada committed to the Paris Agreement, aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transition toward a low-carbon economy. Efforts include investments in renewable energy sources such as hydroelectric, wind, and solar power, as well as initiatives to improve energy efficiency and reduce pollution. Several provinces have introduced carbon pricing systems to incentivize reductions, though policies vary widely across regions. Environmental protection also extends to preserving biodiversity. Canada's numerous national parks and protected areas safeguard habitats for wildlife like bears, wolves, moose, and migratory birds. Conservation programs focus on endangered species and restoration of ecosystems affected by human activity. Indigenous peoples play a crucial role in environmental stewardship, blending traditional knowledge with modern science. Many Indigenous-led conservation initiatives aim to protect sacred lands and waters, promoting sustainability and cultural preservation. However, balancing economic development with environmental priorities remains challenging. Resource extraction industries, including oil sands, mining, and logging, are vital to the economy but pose environmental risks. Debates over pipeline projects and land use often highlight tensions between economic interests, indigenous rights, and environmental concerns. Public awareness and activism have grown, especially among younger generations who demand stronger climate action. Movements for sustainability, green jobs, and environmental justice continue to influence policy and society. Canada's path forward requires innovation, collaboration, and respect for both nature and the diverse peoples who call this land home. Protecting the environment is no longer optional. It is essential for the country's future prosperity and well-being. Canada's culture today is a rich tapestry woven from diverse histories, traditions, and voices. From Indigenous storytelling and art to the vibrant expressions of immigrant communities, Canadian culture reflects the country's complexity and creativity. Indigenous peoples contribute profoundly to Canada's cultural identity. Their art, music, dance, and literature are increasingly recognized globally for their depth and beauty. Initiatives to preserve and revitalize Indigenous languages and traditions are vital threads in the national fabric, promoting understanding and reconciliation. Canada's multiculturalism brings a wealth of artistic expression. Festivals celebrate everything from South Asian Diwali to Caribbean Carnival, from Chinese New Year to Italian heritage events. These celebrations are not only cultural showcases, but also opportunities for education, connection, and shared joy. Canadian literature boasts internationally acclaimed authors like Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, and Michael Ondaatje, whose works explore themes of identity, history, and the human experience. The nation's film industry, centered in Toronto and Vancouver, produces both mainstream hits and independent films that highlight Canadian stories. Music in Canada ranges from traditional Indigenous drum circles to contemporary pop, rock, jazz, and hip-hop. Artists like Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Drake, and The Weeknd have made global impacts, showcasing Canada's diverse musical landscape. Theater, visual arts, and dance also flourish, supported by government programs and private initiatives that nurture emerging talents. Museums and galleries across the country preserve and display artifacts and artworks that tell Canada's multifaceted story. Language plays a crucial role in cultural identity. The coexistence of English and French as official languages shapes education, media, and daily life. At the same time, the preservation of Indigenous and immigrant languages enriches Canada's linguistic mosaic. Canadian culture is dynamic and evolving, a space where tradition meets innovation, and diverse voices contribute to a shared sense of belonging. It embodies the values of openness, creativity, and respect that Canadians hold dear. Through culture and the arts, Canada tells its story, one of resilience, diversity, and the ongoing quest to understand what it means to be Canadian in a changing world. Canada has long sought to define itself not just by its geography or internal diversity, but also by its role on the global stage. From its early contributions to peacekeeping to its participation in international organizations, Canada has built a reputation as a mediator, a promoter of human rights, and a committed ally. After World War II, Canada emerged as a founding member of the United Nations, championing peace and international cooperation. Canadian forces have participated in numerous peacekeeping missions, earning respect for neutrality and effectiveness in conflict zones like Cyprus, Bosnia, and Rwanda. Beyond military engagement, Canada plays an active role in global diplomacy. It is a member of the G7, NATO, and various trade organizations, working to promote democratic values, economic stability, and sustainable development worldwide. Trade remains a cornerstone of Canada's international strategy. The country has negotiated numerous agreements, including USMCA with the United States and Mexico, and deals with the European Union and Pacific Rim countries, aiming to diversify markets and strengthen economic ties. Canada also faces complex diplomatic challenges. Balancing its close relationship with the United States with independent foreign policy decisions requires careful negotiation. Issues like climate change, migration, and global security demand multilateral cooperation and leadership. Humanitarian aid is another area where Canada contributes significantly, supporting refugee resettlement and development programs around the world. Canadian NGOs and government agencies work to alleviate poverty, promote education, and protect human rights. However, Canada's global role is not without criticism. Debates continue over military involvement, Indigenous rights at home, and the country's responses to global crises. Balancing national interests with international responsibilities remains a delicate task. As the world faces rapid change, Canada's commitment to diplomacy, peace, and global cooperation will shape its place in the 21st century, striving to be a force for good amid uncertainty and complexity. Canada stands at a pivotal moment in its history. The story that began thousands of years ago with the Indigenous peoples and evolved through centuries of exploration, colonization, and nation-building now faces the complexities of the 21st century. The country's future will be shaped by its ability to confront pressing challenges and seize emerging opportunities. One of the defining features of Canada's future is its continuing diversity. With immigration expected to remain a key driver of population growth, Canada will become even more multicultural. This demographic richness offers enormous cultural, social, and economic benefits, but also requires ongoing efforts to foster inclusion, combat discrimination, and promote social cohesion. Technological advancement will play a transformative role. As automation, artificial intelligence, and green technologies evolve, Canada must invest in education and training to prepare its workforce. Innovation hubs and research institutions will be vital in maintaining competitiveness in a rapidly changing global economy. Climate change represents both a critical threat and an area for leadership. Canada's vast natural resources and ecosystems are vulnerable to warming temperatures, melting ice, and extreme weather. The country's commitment to sustainability, renewable energy, and carbon reduction will define its environmental and economic future. The journey toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples remains ongoing. Beyond apologies and commissions, it involves honoring treaties, supporting Indigenous governance, and ensuring equitable access to resources and opportunities. True reconciliation demands listening, learning, and sustained action from all Canadians. Politically, Canada faces the challenge of balancing regional autonomy and national unity. The diversity of its provinces and territories, each with distinct identities and priorities, requires flexible governance and respectful dialogue. The vitality of Canada's democracy depends on inclusive participation and upholding rights and freedoms. On the international stage, Canada aspires to be a mediator and advocate for peace, human rights, and global cooperation. Navigating geopolitical complexities will require diplomatic skill and a clear vision aligned with Canadian values. Ultimately, Canada's story is one of resilience and hope. It is a nation continually redefining itself through the contributions of all its people. The road ahead will not be easy, but with a foundation built on respect, diversity, and shared purpose, Canada is poised to face the future with strength and optimism. Canada stands on the brink of a technological revolution that promises to reshape every aspect of life. From urban centers to remote communities, innovation is driving economic growth, improving quality of life, and redefining what's possible. Artificial intelligence, AI, is at the forefront. Canadian researchers and companies are pioneering developments in machine learning, robotics, and data analytics. AI applications range from healthcare, where algorithms assist in diagnosing diseases, to agriculture, optimizing crop yields, and to smart cities improving traffic and energy use. Quantum computing, though still in early stages, holds transformative potential. Canadian institutions invest heavily in this field, aiming to solve problems beyond the reach of today's computers, impacting security, materials science, and finance. Green technology is another key area. With global urgency around climate change, Canada focuses on clean energy solutions. Solar, wind, hydroelectric power, and emerging technologies like hydrogen fuel cells. Efforts to develop sustainable transportation, including electric vehicles and improved public transit, aim to reduce carbon footprints. Innovation hubs like Toronto's Mars Discovery District and Montreal's AI Research Center serve as incubators for startups, attracting talent and investment. These ecosystems foster collaboration between universities, businesses, and government, fueling economic diversification. Digital infrastructure expansion is a priority. Efforts to bring high-speed internet to rural and Indigenous communities aim to bridge the digital divide, enabling education, telemedicine, and remote work opportunities. However, rapid technological change also raises concerns. Privacy, data security, and ethical use of AI demand thoughtful regulation and public dialogue, ensuring that the benefits of innovation reach all Canadians, regardless of geography or background, remains a critical challenge. Canada's commitment to education and skills training is key to preparing its workforce for a future shaped by automation and new technologies. Programs emphasize lifelong learning and adaptability, recognizing that jobs and industries will continue to evolve. In this era of change, Canada's ability to harness technology responsibly and inclusively will determine its prosperity and global competitiveness. The future is one of opportunity, but only if innovation aligns with values of equity, sustainability, and community. Canada's economy is increasingly digital, transforming how people work, communicate, and create value. The rise of online platforms, remote work, and digital services has accelerated, reshaping traditional industries and opening new opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic hastened this shift, pushing many businesses to adopt digital tools and remote collaboration. This change allowed companies to reach broader markets, while employees gained flexibility. However, it also revealed inequalities, with some workers lacking access to reliable internet or suitable home workspaces. E-commerce has exploded in Canada, with online shopping becoming a daily routine for millions. Small businesses now compete globally through digital marketplaces, leveraging social media and digital marketing to grow. This shift demands new skills in technology, logistics, and customer engagement. The gig economy, freelance, contract, and platform-based work has expanded. While offering flexibility, it also raises questions about job security, benefits, and workers' rights. Policymakers are grappling with how to regulate this evolving labor market fairly. Automation and artificial intelligence are reshaping jobs across sectors. Routine tasks in manufacturing, retail, and even professional services are increasingly automated, requiring workers to adapt. Canada is investing in reskilling and upskilling initiatives, promoting STEM education and vocational training to prepare the workforce for future demands. Digital literacy is essential not only for employment, but also for full participation in society. Government programs aim to bridge gaps, especially in remote and Indigenous communities, to ensure equitable access to digital tools and education. Startups and innovation in fintech, health tech, and creative industries contribute significantly to Canada's economy. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal are recognized global hubs for technology and innovation, attracting talent and investment. The digital economy also presents challenges around privacy, cybersecurity, and data sovereignty. Canadians demand transparent policies that protect personal information while encouraging innovation. Balancing rapid technological progress with social equity is a defining challenge for Canada's economic future. The goal is to create an inclusive digital economy that benefits all citizens, fostering opportunity and resilience in a changing world. Canada's vision for the future is deeply intertwined with sustainability. As climate change accelerates, the country is striving to build a green economy that balances growth with environmental responsibility, innovation with preservation. Renewable energy is at the heart of this transformation. Canada already generates a significant portion of its electricity from hydroelectric power, but the expansion of solar, wind, and tidal energy projects is gaining momentum. Provinces like British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario lead initiatives to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Investments in green infrastructure, such as energy-efficient buildings, electric vehicle charging networks, and smart grids, are creating jobs and reducing carbon footprints. Federal and provincial governments have introduced incentives and regulations to encourage businesses and consumers to adopt cleaner technologies. Canadian companies are also pioneering in carbon capture and storage, biofuels, and sustainable agriculture. Innovations in these fields not only reduce emissions, but create economic opportunities in rural and Indigenous communities. The transition to a green economy presents challenges. Balancing resource extraction industries, like oil sands and mining, with environmental goals requires careful policymaking and community engagement. The shift demands retraining workers and supporting regions dependent on traditional industries. Indigenous leadership is central to Canada's environmental future. Many Indigenous communities advocate for conservation and sustainable land management, combining traditional knowledge with modern science. Collaborative projects offer models for reconciliation and ecological stewardship. Public awareness and activism around climate change have grown, with youth movements pushing governments for stronger action. Canadians increasingly recognize that protecting the environment is essential for health, economy, and quality of life. Canada's commitment to international agreements, like the Paris Accord, signals its dedication to global efforts against climate change. Success depends on innovation, investment, and cooperation across all sectors of society. The green economy represents not only a necessity, but an opportunity, a chance for Canada to lead in sustainability, create resilient jobs, and protect the planet for future generations. Canada recognizes that its future prosperity depends heavily on education and skills development. As technological advancements and economic shifts accelerate, preparing the workforce and society to adapt is paramount. The country invests in a robust education system, from primary schools to world-class universities and colleges. Canadian institutions emphasize critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration, equipping students for a rapidly changing world. There is a growing focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, education, recognizing its importance in driving innovation and competitiveness. Specialized programs in artificial intelligence, robotics, and data science prepare students for emerging fields. Lifelong learning is becoming a central concept. As automation changes job landscapes, many Canadians will need to reskill or upskill multiple times during their careers. Governments and private sector partners offer training programs, online courses, and apprenticeships to facilitate this transition. Indigenous education is a critical priority. Efforts to integrate Indigenous history, languages, and culture into curricula help promote understanding and reconciliation, while improving educational outcomes for Indigenous youth. Access and equity remain challenges. Rural, remote, and economically disadvantaged communities sometimes face barriers to quality education and digital resources. Addressing these disparities is essential for ensuring all Canadians can participate fully in the economy and society. Higher education and research drive innovation and economic development. Universities and colleges collaborate with industries to commercialize new technologies and foster entrepreneurship. Canada's commitment to education extends beyond its borders through international student programs and research partnerships, attracting talent and fostering global connections. Preparing Canadians for the future means fostering adaptability, resilience, and inclusivity, ensuring that no one is left behind as the nation navigates the complex changes ahead. Canada's social fabric is continuously evolving, shaped by shifting demographics and changing values. Understanding these trends is essential to grasp how the nation will adapt and thrive in the future. Immigration remains a key driver of population growth. Canada's open policies welcome hundreds of thousands of newcomers each year, contributing to economic vitality and cultural diversity. These newcomers bring languages, customs, and perspectives that enrich Canadian society. At the same time, Canada faces challenges related to an aging population. As life expectancy rises, a growing share of citizens are seniors, increasing demand for healthcare, social services, and retirement support. This demographic shift prompts innovations in elder care, community planning, and labor force participation. Urbanization continues as more Canadians live in cities and metropolitan areas. While this trend drives economic growth and cultural exchange, it also raises concerns about housing affordability, infrastructure, and environmental sustainability. Social attitudes are changing, with greater awareness and advocacy around issues such as gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial justice. Movements for social inclusion and equity influence policy and public discourse, shaping a more inclusive Canada. At the same time, disparities persist. Indigenous communities, racial minorities, and economically disadvantaged groups often face systemic barriers. Addressing these inequalities remains a central focus for governments and civil society. Mental health awareness has increased, leading to improved services and reduced stigma, but more work is needed to ensure accessible care for all. Technology influences social interaction, with digital platforms reshaping communication, education, and entertainment. This brings opportunities and challenges, including concerns about privacy, misinformation, and social isolation. Canada's evolving society reflects its commitment to diversity, equality, and resilience. Embracing change while addressing persistent issues will determine the nation's strength and cohesion in the decades ahead. The future of Canada is inseparable from the futures of its Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose histories stretch back thousands of years. In recent decades, Indigenous communities have been leading powerful movements to reclaim their rights, revitalize cultures, and shape their destinies. Central to this future is the ongoing process of self-determination. Many Indigenous nations are advancing governance agreements that recognize their authority over traditional territories, resources, and social programs. These agreements aim to correct historical injustices and empower communities to thrive on their own terms. Language revitalization efforts are vibrant and growing. Indigenous languages, once suppressed, are being taught in schools, preserved through technology, and celebrated in cultural events. Language is a core element of identity and a bridge to ancestral knowledge. Economic development in Indigenous communities is expanding. From renewable energy projects to tourism, artisanal crafts to fisheries, Indigenous entrepreneurship is creating jobs and wealth while respecting traditional values and sustainability. Education and youth engagement are vital priorities. Indigenous youth are increasingly pursuing higher education and leadership roles, guided by culturally relevant programs that honor their heritage. Healing from the painful legacy of residential schools continues. Truth, remembrance, and reconciliation shape national conversations, fostering understanding and solidarity. Challenges remain: poverty, health disparities, and inadequate infrastructure persist in many Indigenous communities. Addressing these requires collaboration, funding, and respect. The resilience and leadership of Indigenous peoples are transforming Canada's future. By honoring treaties, supporting Indigenous governance, and embracing cultural renewal, Canada moves toward a more just and inclusive society. Canada's story is far from finished. As a nation built on a foundation of diversity, resilience, and shared values, it faces the future with cautious optimism and a commitment to growth. The challenges ahead are significant. Climate change demands urgent action. Social inequalities require sustained attention, and political complexities call for ongoing dialogue and cooperation. Yet, Canada's strength lies in its ability to confront difficulties together, embracing multiculturalism, innovation, and respect for all its peoples. The nation's democratic institutions, while tested, continue to adapt and evolve, reflecting the voices of millions. Canadians increasingly engage in conversations about identity, inclusion, and justice, striving to make their country more equitable and compassionate. Indigenous peoples' leadership and contributions are central to Canada's path forward, weaving ancient wisdom into modern solutions. Their stories, languages, and rites enrich the nation's character and guide its moral compass. Technological innovation offers new tools to solve old problems and create prosperity, but must be balanced with ethical considerations and a focus on inclusion. Environmentally, Canada's vast and beautiful landscapes remind its citizens of their responsibility to steward the land for future generations. Efforts to reconcile economic growth with sustainability will define the nation's legacy. Canada remains a place where hope persists, hope that through understanding, dialogue, and cooperation, the nation can build a future that honors its complex past and embraces its potential. As the maple leaf continues to fly proudly, Canada's journey is one of ongoing discovery, challenge, and opportunity, a living story inviting all its people to shape what comes next.